The phone in Deshaun Carter's truck rang twice before he picked it up, one hand still on the loader controls. "How much can you take this week?" Roy Fincher asked. No greeting, straight to business the way he'd been for the last year. "Depends how clean it comes off the stand," Deshaun said. "Cleaner than last season," Roy told him. "We fixed that trash screen you complained about in March. Then keep it separate, and I'll move it Friday." Roy hung up without saying goodbye, same as always, and Deshaun set the phone down and looked out at the yard behind him. 4 windrows, numbered on painted stakes, steam lifting off the second one in the cold morning air, a stake sunk with a thermometer nobody needed to explain anymore. 2 buyers were already on his list for that Friday load before it even finished curing, and one of them, a landscape supply yard 2 counties over, had asked the week before how much he needed to reserve to avoid waiting until spring. Deshaun walked the length of the yard before climbing back into the loader, past a screened black pile still faintly warm from the machine, past a row of empty pallets waiting on the next batch to finish, past the old burn barrel nobody used anymore because there was nothing left over to burn. 12 years earlier, none of this had a name. 12 years earlier, there was just a pile behind the Carter family barn, growing a little taller every ginning season, tan and fibrous, and completely unremarkable to anyone who'd grown up walking past it. Deshaun was 20 that year the story really starts, living on his family's small piece of land in South Georgia with his mother Yvonne, who ran a modest greenhouse operation growing vegetable transplants for a handful of local farms. The greenhouse barely turned a profit most seasons, and the tractor they used to move flats and haul supplies had been overdue for a transmission repair for longer than either of them wanted to admit. Deshaun worked part-time at the greenhouse alongside his mother and picked up seasonal shifts at Fincher Gin down the road during harvest, running the yard and helping load cotton modules onto the gin stand line. He understood plants and soil the way anyone raised around a greenhouse understood them, what a healthy seedling looked like, what yellowing meant, what happened when beds got too wet or too dry. He didn't understand industrial composting. And he definitely didn't understand why a gin manager would keep paying a small dumping fee every season just to leave a mountain of waste on somebody else's back acreage instead of hauling it off entirely. That arrangement had started before Deshaun was born, back when his grandfather agreed to let the gin dump its byproduct on an unused corner of the property in exchange for a modest yearly payment. His grandfather used to spread a little of it on the poorer ground near the tree line every few years, figuring it couldn't hurt and might loosen up soil that had gone hard and clay-heavy in patches. Though nobody ever measured whether it actually helped, it seemed harmless enough at the time. Free organic matter, a little extra income, nothing anybody thought too hard about. 12 ginning seasons later, the pile had grown into something enormous, burrs and hull fragments, and stems and leaf trash all packed together into a tan, fibrous mountain that steamed faintly on cold mornings and occasionally caught the wind, sending fine dust drifting toward the house. Deshaun had grown up next to that pile the way a person grows up next to a water tower or an old barn, present, familiar, and completely invisible as anything worth a second look. Fincher Gin ran 3 shifts during harvest, trucks hauling in cotton modules from farms across the county, the gin stands stripping seed from lint in a steady roar of belts and blowers, and everything that wasn't usable lint or seed ending up on a conveyor headed for the back lot. Inside the gin building itself, dust hung thick enough in the afternoon light that the overhead bulbs looked hazy, and workers moved between the stands with the kind of practiced caution that came from years of watching cotton dust settle on every surface it touched. Outside, loaders pushed the tan waste into growing rows near the Carter property line, the wind occasionally catching a loose gust of fiber and carrying it toward the barn like a slow-moving snowfall that never quite melted. Roy Fincher managed the operation, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd run that gin for 2 decades and inherited the dumping arrangement along with everything else. "That pile's been sitting there 12 years because nobody wants it," Roy told Deshaun once, catching him staring at it a little longer than usual during a slow stretch on the yard. He wasn't being unkind about it, just stating what seemed obvious to a man who dealt with the material every single day. Deshaun didn't argue with him. He just kept working, but the comment sat with him the way things sometimes did. The idea didn't really take shape until a Saturday that spring when Deshawn drove his mother to a garden supply store 2 towns over to pick up seed trays. He wandered the outdoor section while she shopped and stopped in front of a pallet stacked with bagged soil amendment, 40-pound sacks, selling for more money than he expected for something that was, as far as he could tell, mostly composted plant material. He picked one up and read the label, screened, composted, blended for consistent nutrient release, and thought about the pile behind his family's barn, sitting there doing nothing, costing the gin money just to leave in place. Why is this pile worthless behind our barn, he wondered. But something almost identical sells for real money right here. He didn't have an answer yet, and he was smart enough that spring to know the question wasn't as simple as it sounded. His first attempt proved that almost immediately. He shoveled a truckload of raw material straight off the pile, filled a stack of old feed sacks with it, and sold a dozen bags to gardeners around town for a few dollars each, figuring organic material was organic material. Within a week, 2 of those customers called back unhappy. One said the bag had started heating up in his shed, warm enough that he worried about it catching fire. Another said he'd spread it straight onto a garden bed and his tomato seedlings turned yellow and stalled out within days instead of growing. A third simply said it smelled sour and he'd thrown the whole bag out. He drove out to the third customer's house himself to apologize and pick up what was left of the bag, more embarrassed than he expected to be over a dozen sacks of dirt. Deshawn drove out to check the pile again after those calls, digging into it with a shovel the way he never really had before, and found the middle of it warm to the touch even on a cool afternoon, steam curling up faintly where the shovel disturbed it. Raw material wasn't finished compost. That much was obvious now, even if he didn't yet understand exactly why. He mentioned the problem to a county extension agent named Carla Whitfield, who came out to a farm meeting that spring to talk about soil health and stayed afterward to answer his questions about the pile. She explained, without making it sound complicated, that fresh organic material needed a proper carbon to nitrogen balance, enough moisture without too much, and airflow to break down evenly, and that raw material dumped in one giant heap almost never did any of that on its own. She told him the center of an unmanaged pile could overheat and even smolder, while the outer edges stayed dry and barely decomposed at all, which explained both the heat his customers complained about and the sour smell from the third bag. She also told him woody stems broke down slower than the finer material, which meant an unscreened, unmixed pile would always behave inconsistently no matter how long it sat. You want it to decompose evenly and finish before anybody uses it, she said. Right now you're selling people something that's still cooking. She told him about another grower she'd once advised, years back, who'd tried selling raw sawmill shavings as mulch without curing them first, and ended up with the same kind of angry phone calls Deshawn was getting now, just with a different raw material behind them. It's not really about cotton or wood chips, Carla said. It's about whether you let the material finish becoming what it's going to be before you hand it to somebody else. Deshawn thanked her and drove home, turning that phrase over in his head. Still cooking, because it explained everything that had gone wrong in one plain sentence. He started small that summer, building a single test windrow off to the side of the main pile instead of just scooping from wherever was convenient. He mixed in poultry litter from a neighbor's chicken operation to balance the nitrogen, since Carla had told him fresh cotton gin waste ran heavy on carbon and light on nitrogen, which slowed decomposition and could even rob nitrogen from any plant it touched too early. He borrowed his uncle's old loader to turn the windrow every week, checking moisture by hand, and later with a cheap probe thermometer he bought once he'd saved enough from his gin wages. The first few weeks were mostly failure disguised as learning. One turn came out too wet and started to smell sour within days. A section of that same wet turn grew a patchy white and gray mold across the surface before he caught it, forcing him to pull the whole section out and start it over from scratch. Another sat too dry and barely heated at all, which Carla told him meant almost nothing was breaking down. He adjusted, added water on the dry turns, added dry material on the wet ones, and slowly the windrow started behaving the way she'd described, heating up in the middle, cooling as it matured, developing a dark, earthy smell instead of the sour or sharp odor his first bagged batches had carried. It took nearly 4 months before that first test windrow finished curing to something he felt confident calling a product. He screened it by hand through an old piece of fencing wire stretched over a frame, sorting out the coarser stems that hadn't fully broken down, and was left with a dark, crumbly material that looked almost nothing like the tan fibrous pile it had started as. Before he trusted it with anyone else's crop, he ran his own small test in a corner of his mother's greenhouse, filling a dozen seed trays with a blend of the finished material and ordinary potting soil, planting them with tomato seed just to watch what happened. He also waited until the windrow had cooled and held steady through repeated temperature checks, because Carla had warned him that a pile still reheating after turning was not ready for a nursery bed. He checked those trays every morning for 2 weeks, half expecting the same yellowing and stalling his first bag customers had complained about. The seedlings came up even and green, no stalling, no scorched roots, nothing that gave him a reason to doubt the batch. That was the confidence he needed before he ever knocked on Mara Hollis's door. He brought a 5-gallon bucket of it to Hollis Nursery, a family-run operation just outside town that grew container plants and vegetable starts for sale across 3 counties. The owner, a woman named Mara Hollis, ran her fingers through it, smelled it, and asked him a string of questions he mostly had answers for this time: moisture content, curing time, what it was blended with, whether it had been tested for maturity. "I had somebody bring me raw cotton trash years ago and try to sell it as mulch," she said. "Killed half a bed of transplants. I don't take chances on that kind of material anymore." "This isn't that," Deshawn said. 4 months in the windrow, screened, and I ran my own tray test before I brought it here." She looked up at that, more interested than she'd let on a moment before. "You tested it yourself first," she said, half a question. "Didn't want to bring you something I hadn't already put a seed in," he said. She agreed to a small trial anyway, 10 cubic yards blended into a portion of her potting mix for a batch of tomato transplants, on the condition that she could reject the whole order if anything looked wrong within the first 2 weeks. Deshawn drove home that evening without much confidence, replaying every question she'd asked and wondering if he'd actually answered any of them well enough. Nothing went wrong. The transplants grew evenly, no yellowing, no stalling. And Mara placed a second order before the first one had even finished being used. It wasn't a huge sale, a few $100s against everything he'd already spent on poultry litter and loader fuel and months of turning. But it was proof, the same kind of proof his first buyer had once given him at a fraction of the volume he'd eventually need. Word moved slowly through that part of the county, the way it always did, one grower mentioning it to another. Not everyone was impressed. A neighboring farmer named Curtis Boyette told Deshawn flatly one afternoon that he was, in his words, selling trash to people too polite to say so, and that real growers used commercial fertilizer, not compost dug out of a gin's leftovers. "You're hauling dirt to sell dirt," Curtis said, leaning on the fence between their properties, half amused and half genuinely puzzled. "Been driving past that pile my whole life. Never once thought it was worth a dime." Deshawn didn't argue with him either. He just told Curtis the tomato yields at Hollis Nursery had come in fine, and left it at that. His mother had her own complaints closer to home. The test windrows sat close enough to the house that the smell during the early unbalanced batches had drifted toward the porch more than once, and Yvonne told him plainly one evening that she didn't appreciate opening her kitchen window to something that smelled like it was going bad. "It's not going bad," he said. "It's working. It smells like it's going bad," she said back, and he didn't have a comeback for that, so he moved the operation further from the house the following weekend, same as he'd have done if she'd asked twice. A loan officer at the local bank turned him down that same summer when he asked about financing a proper screening machine, telling him gently that lending against unproven agricultural byproduct wasn't something the bank had much appetite for, no matter how good his handful of nursery sales looked on paper. "Come back when you've got 2 full seasons of contracts instead of 2 customers," the loan officer told him, sliding his folder of receipts back across the desk. Deshawn didn't take it personally, though it stung a little walking out past the parking lot with the same folder he'd walked in with. He kept screening by hand a while longer after that, and it cost him time he didn't always have. By the second year, Deshawn had 4 windrows running instead of 1, Each started a few weeks apart so he'd have material at different stages of maturity instead of everything finishing at once. He added a second customer, a greenhouse operation growing pepper and tomato transplants for a regional grocery supplier, and started delivering on a loose weekly schedule instead of whenever a batch happened to be ready. He bought a used mechanical screen that sprang with money saved from both jobs, cutting hours of hand, sifting down to a fraction of the time, and hired a cousin named Antoine part-time to help turn windrows and load deliveries once the volume outgrew what he could manage after gin shifts and greenhouse work. Antoine wasn't convinced at first that shoveling composted cotton waste counted as a real job, and he said so more than once during those early weeks, but the paychecks cleared every time, and after a while he stopped bringing it up. Demand kept building through that second season, faster than his curing windrows could really keep pace with, and that gap between demand and finished, mature material was where the real trouble started. A commercial strawberry operation 2 counties over placed the largest order Deshawn had received yet, enough finished product to amend several acres of new beds ahead of fall planting, with a deadline the grower needed to hit before their transplants went in the ground. The grower, a man named Philip Reardon who ran nearly 40 acres of strawberries, told Deshawn on the phone that he'd heard good things through Mara Hollis and wanted to try switching his whole amendment program over if this first large order performed the way her nursery batches had. Deshawn didn't have that much fully cured material ready. He had close to enough if he counted a windrow that still needed another 2 to 3 weeks to finish properly. He told himself the difference wouldn't matter much, that the batch was close enough that the grower's beds would sit for a little while before planting anyway, giving the material extra time to settle even after delivery. He was afraid of losing the account before he'd really built it, and that fear made the decision instead of his own standards. He shipped the order, blending the nearly finished windrow in with what was fully cured, and told himself it would be fine. For about a week it was. Then the strawberry grower called, and he wasn't calm about it. "You told me this stuff was finished," Philip said, his voice tight in a way that made Deshawn's stomach drop before he'd even explained what happened. "I've got beds heating up and transplants sitting there not growing." The beds had heated up after planting, warm enough to stress the young transplants, and several sections showed stunted growth within days. Plants sitting pale and stalled instead of establishing normally. A soil test the grower ran on his own confirmed what Deshawn already suspected before he even drove out there. The material was still actively decomposing, pulling nitrogen out of the bed instead of releasing it, exactly the kind of problem Carla had warned him about with the very first batch he'd ever ruined. Deshawn couldn't blame the weather for this one. He couldn't blame the gin, and he couldn't blame the grower for expecting exactly what he himself had promised. He'd known the batch wasn't fully cured, and he'd shipped it anyway because he was scared of the alternative. The drive out to Philip's farm felt longer than it actually was, replaying in his head exactly what he was going to say and how little of it would actually fix anything. He drove out that week and told the grower the truth without softening it, replaced the material at his own cost, covered the hauling both directions, and reimbursed a portion of the transplant losses even though the grower hadn't demanded it outright. It cost him nearly everything that account had been worth, and it cost him something else too, a kind of confidence he'd been building since that first bucket he'd brought to Mara Hollis. Mara heard about it eventually, the way these things traveled in a farming community that size, and asked him about it directly the next time he delivered to her nursery. "You shipped it early because you were scared of losing them," she said, not really a question. "Yeah," he admitted. "That's the mistake that matters," she told him. "Everything else you can learn your way out of. That one you fix by never doing it again." He sat with that on the drive home, the way he'd once sat with Carla's phrase about material still cooking, turning it over until it settled into something clearer than just regret. The problem wasn't that he hadn't worked hard enough that season. The problem was that he'd been trying to sell biological maturity on a customer's schedule instead of the material's own schedule, and no amount of hustle could force decomposition to finish early just because a deadline said otherwise. The gin gave him raw material for almost nothing. His customers had never really been paying for that material. They were paying for the promise that whatever left his yard had already finished, becoming what it was supposed to be. He spent the rest of that year building a system that made sure he never had to guess again. He numbered every windrow with a painted stake and logged its start date the day it began, instead of relying on memory the way he had before. He set a hard minimum curing period based on what Carla and his own temperature logs had taught him, and refused to sell anything that hadn't hit that minimum, no matter how good the offer on the phone sounded. He divided the yard into 3 clearly marked zones: active windrows still heating, curing windrows cooling down, and finished, screened, ready to sell material kept separate from everything still in process. He painted a simple sign at the entrance to each zone, so there was never a question, even for Antoine on a rushed morning, about which pile was safe to load and which one still needed weeks. He started keeping a small reserve of finished product at all times, instead of selling every available yard the moment an order came in, so a big request couldn't tempt him into shipping something before it was ready ever again. None of it happened overnight, but by the following spring, the operation ran on records and rules instead of hope and good intentions. That was also the year he went back to Roy Fincher with something more structured than the loose arrangement his grandfather had started 12 years earlier. He proposed that the gin keep its cleanest byproduct separate from anything mixed with dirt, plastic, baling wire, or other contamination, dumping it in a designated bay instead of the general pile. In exchange, Deshawn would clear that material on a fixed weekly schedule, reducing how much space the gin needed for storage and how often Roy's crew had to deal with hauling or spreading leftover waste themselves. "And what's Fincher Gin get if I do all that sorting on my end?" Roy asked, arms crossed, the same posture he'd had the day he told Deshawn nobody wanted that pile. "Lower disposal pressure," Deshawn said. "Less material sitting around your yard. And once volume's steady, I'll pay a per-load fee instead of the flat rate my grandfather set up." Roy turned that over for a moment, clearly doing his own math, and agreed to a trial season. He asked one more question before he agreed, wanting to know what would stop Deshawn from just taking the clean material and leaving the messier loads for the gin to deal with on its own. "I'm not asking you to sort everything perfect," Deshawn said. "Just keep the trash and dirt out of what you dump in that bay. I'll take what's left, clean or not, as long as it's not contaminated." By the second month of clean, separated material coming off the gin stand, he made the arrangement permanent. Distance mattered more than Deshawn expected once volume grew past those first small test batches. Raw cotton gin waste was bulky and light for its size, which meant a truckload of unprocessed material barely covered the fuel cost of hauling it any real distance. He learned to keep his processing yard close to both gins instead of trying to haul raw waste back to a central location, screening and curing near the source and only trucking the finished, denser product out to customers once it had lost most of its bulk and moisture. That decision kept his delivery radius practical, mostly within an hour's drive, and he turned down a few interested buyers further out rather than let trucking costs eat into a margin that wasn't large to begin with. By the third year, Deshawn had added a second supply agreement with a smaller gin one county over, whose manager had heard about the Fincher arrangement through the kind of small-town channel that carried news faster than any advertisement could. He had a small crew running the yard by then, Antoine full-time and 2 part-time hands during peak turning season, along with a delivery route that covered nurseries, greenhouse growers, and 1 bulk landscape supply yard that had started buying finished amendment by the truckload. Not every load that came off either gin made it into the product line. Some arrived too wet. Some carried more soil and trash than the screens could reasonably handle, and Deshawn turned those loads away or set them aside for a slower, lower-grade use, rather than let anything questionable reach a paying customer. That refusal cost him volume sometimes, but it was the same discipline that had turned the strawberry failure into a lesson instead of the end of the business. Demand grew past what steady supply alone could satisfy that third year, and for the first time, Deshawn found himself telling customers no instead of chasing every order that came in. The landscape supply yard called that spring, asking to reserve volume ahead of the season, instead of waiting for whatever was left over. Around the same week, Mara Hollis called about the same finished batch, wanting enough for a large spring planting she had scheduled. "How much do I have to reserve now?" the landscape buyer asked him. "To make sure I'm not waiting until next spring." Deshaun didn't have an answer that satisfied everybody, not that week, and for the first time he had to build an actual allocation plan instead of simply filling orders as they came. He walked his own windrows that evening with a clipboard, counting cubic yards at each stage the way he once counted feed sacks in his mother's garage, trying to figure out how many customers he could actually promise without repeating the mistake that cost him Philip Reardon's account. He split what was ready between both accounts, promised the landscape yard first priority on the next finished windrow, and spent an evening explaining to Mara why she wasn't getting everything she'd asked for, even though she'd been his very first customer. She wasn't thrilled, but she understood it better than most, since she'd been the one who taught him early on that consistency mattered more than volume. Philip Reardon called again that same season too, cautious at first, asking whether Deshaun would consider a smaller trial order to rebuild trust before committing to anything larger. Deshaun agreed, shipped exactly what his log said was ready and nothing more, and delivered it 2 days later than Philip initially wanted, rather than risk the same mistake twice. The beds performed the way they were supposed to that time, and by mid-season Philip had quietly become a repeat customer again, though Deshaun never let himself forget what that account had already cost him once. Combined revenue across both gin sources and the full customer list crossed into strong six-figure territory that year, landing somewhere close to $500,000. None of that was profit outright. Loader time, diesel, poultry litter, screening equipment, wages for 3 people, land improvements, insurance, and a used delivery truck all came out of that number before anything counted as real earnings. The same kind of accounting Deshaun had started keeping in a plain notebook back when his sales barely covered a bag of feed sacks. Roy Fincher had become a different kind of presence by then. Calling ahead most weeks instead of just letting waste pile up, however, was convenient for his crew. "How much can you take this week?" he'd ask, the same words that opened this story, and Deshaun would check his yard space and his customer commitments before answering. The power in that relationship had shifted the same way the ground behind the Carter barn eventually did, quietly, without either man needing to make a point of it. Curtis Boyette, the neighbor who once told him he was hauling dirt to sell dirt, showed up at the yard that same fall asking if Deshaun sold in smaller loads for a home garden, since his own tomatoes hadn't done much the last 2 seasons. Deshaun didn't bring up the fence conversation from years earlier. He just told him the price per yard and asked when he wanted it delivered. On a cool morning that fall, Yvonne walked out past the greenhouse to where the old pile used to stand, the one that had grown taller every season since before Deshaun was born. The oldest section of it, the part that had sat untouched the longest, was finally gone, cleared and processed through the windrows over the past 2 seasons until nothing remained but bare, packed dirt she hadn't seen exposed since Deshaun was a boy running past it on his way to the school bus. She stood there a moment, looking at the ground instead of the mountain of tan fiber that used to sit on top of it. "I used to tell people that was just the cotton trash pile," she said, more to herself than to him. Deshaun didn't say anything clever back. He just kept walking the numbered windrows behind her, checking a thermometer stake at row 6, writing the number down in a notebook that had long since stopped being optional. Somewhere past the tree line, a truck engine turned over, headed out toward the landscape yard with a load that had been reserved for 2 weeks before it was even finished curing. The bare dirt behind the barn stayed empty that whole season. The first time in 12 years anyone could remember seeing grass start to grow back in that corner of the property.